welcome the Reverend Dr. Angelique Walker-Smith to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Dr. Chop Pierce, for that kind welcome to the podium. Well, we are in for a treat. I am so delighted that we have official representation from the Religion News Service. I don't know about you, but I'm a daily fan. So hopefully some of you do this too. It's one of my primary sources of keeping up with what's happening in the world from a religious perspective, faith perspective. There are other places that I get my sources from, but this is one of them for sure. And so we were delighted when Adelle Banks said, yes, I will come. And yes, I will present on the issues around U.S. Christianity and will bring a journalist perspective, something not totally neutralized, you know what I mean, but a journalist perspective that can help us move forward into the secular space as well as in the sacred space. I'm so pleased that the committee agreed that she would be the one invited. So let me tell you about Adelle Banks, if you don't know her. Adelle Banks joined the Religion News Service in 1995, so she is well experienced. And she is its project editor and national reporter. She covers topics including religion and race, the faith of African Americans, and partnerships between government and religious groups. So she does work with both, quote, the majority cultures, minority cultures as well. She covers these stories. She is the third place winner of the 2021 Best In-depth Newswriting on Religion Award from the American Academy of Religion. You don't know the American Academy of Religion? That's a big deal. Banks spearheaded RNS Beyond the Most Segregated Hour project, which won a 2021 Wilbur Award from the Religion Communicators Council, and an RNS project on the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington, which won the 2014 Wilbur Award. Banks is a graduate of Mount Holyoke College in South Hadley, Massachusetts. She previously was the religion reporter at the Orlando Sentinel and a reporter at the Providence Journal and newspapers in the upstate New York community, the upstate community of Syracuse and Binghamton. I am delighted that we have someone who is so recognized in her field of expertise, who has done the kind of scrutiny of what stories are out there of religion and of, if you will, faith, sacred and secular. She has said yes to us. I am really excited. I've been able to work with her a few times on some stories, and I know what she brings. It is my great joy to bring to you Miss Adelle Banks.
Thanks very much to Dr. Monica Pierce and Reverend Dr. Angelique Walker. Very much appreciate Walker-Smith, excuse me, for inviting me to speak to you. Today, I want to say that I will not be speaking to you with the perspective of a member of the clergy, but a perspective of a journalist. So I'm going to aim for the 5-point talk instead of the 3-point sermon. Okay? And I'm also recording you because I want to have the discussion afterwards for my future reference. So I hope that's okay with everybody. Okay. So I also want to say that I could not be speaking to you today if it had not been for people like you and all of your colleagues and congregants and staff members who have been good enough to answer my calls, as well as those of other people at Religion News Service, as well as our emails and our text messages and however else we might try to communicate with you. So I know what I'm going to tell you because people like you have talked to us. So thank you for that. And I will say that if you haven't been in touch with RNS, or RNS hasn't been in touch with you, I'm happy to collect your contact information. And the last slide will have my contact information so that we can stay in touch. So the state of US Christianity is reportedly dwindling, scandal-filled, frequently polarized, sometimes diverse, and still innovative. So the next slide, please. It will probably come as no surprise to you that first on my list is the topic of decline. There have been numerous reports from organizations like Gallup and denominations themselves that describe Christianity with statistics relating to loss of membership. There also are predictions about its future. And my RNS colleague, Bob Smetana, wrote 3 weeks ago about a Pew Research Center report that suggests that by 2070, Christians could make up less than half of the US population and possibly as little as a third. Christianity would continue, it found, but non-Christian faiths and secular people, including the nuns, that's N-O-N-E-S, or the religiously unaffiliated, will be on the rise. So these projections are based on factors such as birth rates and age and sex, migration patterns, and the current religious landscape. The report states, while the scenarios in this report vary in the extent of religious disaffiliation they project, they all show Christians continuing to shrink as a share of the US population. I should note that at the end of the story, my colleague mentioned that while the researchers said their data doesn't show a gradual or sudden revival of Christianity or religion in general in this country, that does not mean a religious revival is impossible. And Bob Smetana also has recently written a book called Reorganized Religion that I recommend to you. In it, among other things, he breaks down these demographic changes that have been explored in previous research. And he sums it up in this way. In other words, America's grandparents go to church. Their grandkids do not. America's grandparents are white and Christian. Their grandkids are not. He recalled the church growth movement when megachurches moved away from robed choirs, preachers in suits, and pipe organs, and declared, "We are not your grandmother's church." But he added, the bigger picture facing churches is this: your grandmother is the one keeping churches alive. The habit of church going as a socially prescribed requirement for a good life or a religious obligation is no longer embraced by most Americans, especially younger Americans. I did say, I think it was interesting that your gathering was really focusing on including younger Americans. So despite these reports of decline and pending decline, sometimes there is a different picture painted about the state of congregations, Christian ones as well as others. The Faith Communities Today, or FACT 2020 survey of congregations found that a higher percentage of congregations strongly agreed they were spiritually vital and alive than in 2015 or 2010. And that meant that they had some particular characteristics. Some of those facets were they were open to incorporating new people, willing to change to meet new challenges, and had more younger people participating. So the congregations featured in the FACT research were surveyed before the COVID-19 lockdown, but they were asked to either speak from that perspective or reflect the pre-pandemic situation. But there is a survey or surveys by the Evangelical Council for Financial Accountability that found that some church leaders saw growth in their congregations despite the prevalence of COVID-19. While only 7% of new churches drew 200 or more people on launch day in 2020, that number rebounded to 20% in 2021. Next slide, please. So the second point is that Christianity is scandal-filled. News of reports on sexual abuse and questions about possible financial wrongdoing often fill my news outlets' reports. Names once held in high regard now are considered people who have fallen from grace, or models for how a church leader should not behave. The Executive Committee of the Southern Baptist Convention, the nation's largest Protestant denomination, is under investigation by the Justice Department following an independent report released in May that found Southern Baptist leaders mishandled abuse claims and mistreated abuse survivors for decades. In the Anglican Church in North America, a third-party report about this Midwest diocese has shown that leaders failed to act on tips about sexual abuse and misconduct, questioned reported survivors' credibility while defending the innocence of an alleged abuser. My colleague Catherine Post reported about this on Friday. She noted that the diocese of this small denomination, formed in a 2009 split from the Episcopal Church, has been roiled by allegations that a former lay pastor named Mark Rivera had sexually abused young people he met through 2 Illinois churches. The investigation was limited in scope in a number of ways, including that the investigators were asked to gather information, but barred from recommending charges or punishments. And Rivera is on trial right now, facing felony charges of criminal sexual assault. That report said, we were charged with gathering evidence regarding such issues and reporting the information collected, but we were explicitly directed not to render any legal determinations, evaluate or opine about any governance structure issues, or seek to address whether any discipline is warranted. Experts and researchers point out that even when sexual abuse makes headlines, as in the Boston Globe Spotlight investigation of sexual abuse in the Catholic Church 2 decades ago, these patterns of abuse often began much earlier than the time of these reports. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or the Mormon Church, was recently the subject of an Associated Press investigation that found 2 Arizona bishops failed to report a case of a father's sexual abuse of his daughter that continued for 7 years. RNS columnist Jana Reese summed up how this situation, which she called a horrific case, is reflective of factors in both the Mormon faith and other religions, such as, quote unquote, non-transparent leadership systems, a purity culture that shames victims of sexual abuse and silences them, and a sense of superiority that it could never happen here. So she asked, how did I come up with this list? She said, by reading the news again and again about how this is played out in religions not that different from mine. Next slide, please. On the money front, the courts are considering cases involving questions about financial wrongdoing. I have written stories about Staccato Powell, a name many of you may recognize. He's had a prominent ecumenical leadership. He was president of the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church's Board of Bishops. He and another colleague from that denomination's Western
Harold Hunter
were charged in January with fraud and conspiracy
I have 2
related to
separate
allegations of
questions.
handling California church
One of
properties
the
and fraudulently
things that I
gaining millions
purchased
of
recently
dollars
at
for
Apple
personal
was an
use.
Apple Watch 8.
His case continues in a
And
California federal district
there's a
court.
group of us
And in the summer of
that are very
2021, I
formed
asked him
in
if he
reporting
had,
that the
what he
microphone
thought, given these
is
allegations, whether
defective
he thought that
on
he
some of
would be
these devices.
criminally charged. And
And
he
I
told me
use
at
an
that
app
time
called
that he
Just
anticipated
Press
being
Record on my
totally
watch,
exonerated.
which is one of the reasons
So
that
more
I have a
recently in
watch.
May, the
So
African
while I'm
Methodist
driving or
Episcopal
walking or
Church sued a
whatever,
former
I don't
executive
use my phone and I
who
have to worry
oversaw
about
its
it.
pension plans and its
So I'd
investments
like for
portfolio,
someone
charging
to
that he and
look at
others
this and
embezzled
see about
money and
exchanging.
defrauded its
I
clergy and
need a
church
new watch. I'm
ministers
going
who
to
were relying on
pre-owned
its annuity plan for their
on
retirement.
Sundays. I'd like to
So
get
should
in
these and
have it
others
looked at.
be found guilty,
Harold, we can hear
these
you.
and other scandals may be eventually in the courts with fines, settlements, or other edicts. But other solutions include training and scrutiny and caring for those who have been wounded.
I tried to go
For
through the
example,
Apple website. and they
RNS
wouldn't
recently
give me an
reported that
appointment
Jules
before
Woodson,
Sunday,
an abuse
I'd leave
survivor who was
Saturday for
cited in that
Korea.
independent report about the Southern Baptist Convention
And one of the
Executive
places they
Committee, has
referred me to
co-founded
is
a
Best
nonprofit
Dr.
called
Hunter,
Help
please mute yourself.
Hear, Heal. And Woodson, who survived abuse by a youth
Hello, are you
pastor
there?
who
I've been
went on
having
to become a megachurch
connection
pastor,
problems with this
now
call.
plans to
Can you hear
provide
me?
survivors of
We can
sexual
hear you on Zoom.
scholarship
Please
funds
mute
to pay for
yourself.
counseling. She said she wants to help survivors overcome that sense of shame that Jana Reese mentioned in her list of factors contributing to abuse flourishing undetected in some religious settings. We really want to break down the stigma, Woodson told RNS's Bob Smetana last month. We want to give the resources, the access to funding for survivors to get in, make that initial disclosure, start to unpack the trauma they've experienced so they can make a long-term plan for what healing looks like. Next slide, please. Christianity is polarized, as we all know, both before and since the January 6, 2021 insurrection. Just last week, my colleague Yanat Shimron reported on a new survey from Public Religion Research Institute that was conducted by E Pluribus Unum, a nonprofit dedicated to building a more equitable and inclusive South among its findings, 51% of Americans favor preserving Confederate history, memorials, and statues, while 46% are opposed. There are stark differences among religious categories. Majorities of Protestants, Catholics, and Latter-day Saints support efforts to preserve Confederate monuments and memorials, with white evangelicals besting all others at 76%, my colleague wrote. Support falls to 35% among non-Christian Americans, Jewish Americans, and religiously unaffiliated Americans. But there was not a great divide on every topic, my colleague added. Nearly all Americans, 90%, supported efforts to, quote, tell the truth about the history of slavery, violence, and discrimination against racial minorities, as well as efforts to promote racial healing by creating more inclusive public spaces. And she said, but majorities of Americans favored the idea of local governments providing mortgage assistance for people whose descendants were denied home loans because of their race. And a majority also favor scholarships for descendants of enslaved people forced to construct those campuses. White Christians were the least likely to favor those efforts. I'd like to suggest that part of addressing polarization is reading the whole story as well as the whole survey, because sometimes people just hone in on the one thing that people are disagreeing about, but there are some things that people actually agree on, and it's good for people to know that too. But divisions do continue in the wake of January 6th, and my colleague Jack Jenkins and others at my news organization have been covering the fallout from that day and what it means to and about people of faith. He recently wrote a story about Pennsylvania Republican gubernatorial candidate Doug Mastriano, who was near the Capitol on January 6th, but has claimed he left when things turned violent. Mastriano is known for giving voice to Christian nationalism, even though he rejects that term itself. Jack Jenkins wrote about how Mastriano said Christians should show more courage and resist lockdown measures during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. And he cited, of all people, Martin Luther as a role model. And members of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, including former seminary presidents, invoked Christianity to criticize this now state senator, countering with an ad in the local paper, defending their and Luther's support for health of their neighbors. Mastriano, in turn, responded by suggesting the Bible prohibits Christians from publicly criticizing elected officials, all while doling out his own condemnation of local religious leaders. So that was one of Jack Jenkins' reports. So this was an example of how some deal with critiques in these polarizing times. In this case, the Christian leaders took out an ad to tell their case in a newspaper, while Mastriano took his case to Facebook Live. I've been struck in my coverage by efforts to build and recommend understanding in the midst of this growing polarization. The day after January 6th, in that insurrection, I watched an already planned webinar that featured Russell Moore and Justin Gibonnet, who are two Christian experts on religion and culture. It was sponsored by the Ethics and Public Policy Center's Faith Angle Forum and attended by a virtual audience of journalists. Russell Moore said he talks to pastors every day who are exhausted by conspiracy theories in their communities. We can't be exhausted, he said. He told them, we have to be the people who recognize reality and have the integrity to call reality what it is. Justin Gibonnet said Christian faith teaches to be skeptical of the kind of power behind the insurrection, and said theological considerations should override a quote unquote skewed sense of patriotism. At the time, Moore was the president of the Southern Baptist Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission. He's now editor-in-chief of Christianity Today. And Gibonnet is president of the AND campaign, a nonpartisan think tank that focuses on applying biblical values to pressing contemporary issues. They both urge more work, including with the Biden administration, on areas on which people with disparate views can agree. In 2021, I covered a virtual Christian unity gathering of the National Council of Churches, and it included a session in which it was noted that while evangelicals may be the group most often criticized for equating American identity with adherence to Christianity, white progressive Christians have work to do to address their own Christian nationalism. They expressed concern about the relative silence or lack of action by some religious leaders after the storming of the US Capitol. And that word exhaustion came up again in this discussion too, with the Reverend Jim Bear Jacobs, who is a racial justice expert, last I knew, with the Minnesota Council of Churches. He said, being in these realms of white progressive Christian spaces is exhausting for Black and Indigenous people and other people of color. And in very real terms, it's much easier to navigate the conservative spaces because at least there, the racism is overt. There are so many areas of polarization in this country and in Christianity, but I'll just mention two more. First, there's abortion, especially since the Supreme Court's overturning of the Roe v. Wade decision. That continues to be a significant source of division. And some of what Religion News Service has been able to do is point out some of the nuance in views about this divisive topic, despite general thinking that people are either on one side or the other, depending on what faith group they're in. My colleague Jack Jenkins recently wrote about 2 Kansas nuns in the Ursuline, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, Sisters Order, who voiced opposition to a proposed abortion-related amendment in their state's constitution. Despite its support by a local archbishop, the nuns argued the measure, if approved, would have negative repercussions for women and allow politicians to, quote unquote, impose religious beliefs on all Kansans by passing restrictive abortion bans. Archbishop Joseph Naumann of Kansas City, Kansas, on the other hand, advocated for the amendment, which supporters called the Value Them Both Amendment. Later in August, Kansans overwhelmingly rejected the amendment. And my colleague Alejandra Molina wrote about how Latino Catholics surveyed after the overturning of Roe v. Wade had a marked change in their views. Public Religion Research Institute found that 75% of Latino Catholics said abortion should be legal in most or all cases, when in 2010, 51% held that view. And the last point on polarization I'll mention is the debate over the inclusion of LGBTQ people in congregational leadership and in marriage ceremonies. Exhibit A for that now is the United Methodist Church. My colleague, Emily McFarland Miller, has written many RNS stories about the United Methodist Church and now the Global Methodist Church. The United Methodist Church's Council of Bishops president, Thomas Bickerton, in August criticized the negative rhetoric of Methodists who, as of May, had launched this new theologically conservative denomination. It occurred, quote, after decades of rancorous debate over the ordination and marriage of LGBTQ United Methodists, a special session of the United Methodist Church's General Conference, and 3 postponements of a vote to formally split the denomination, Emily McFarland Miller reported. And in a statement, Reverend Keith Boyette, chairman of the Transitional Leadership Council of the Global Methodist Church, described the launch as coming, quote, without fanfare, but full of hope, faith, and perseverance. And that divide has apparently grown. And Yonat Shimron, my colleague, wrote about something that reflected that and how people are trying to deal with it. She wrote an RNS story that indicates interest in dialogue, despite differences. She described an organization called Resetting the Table that as of July has trained some 43,000 people in what she called a carefully structured process that allows participants to listen, speak, and challenge each other respectfully. Participants have mostly been in Jewish settings initially, but the organization has expanded to other religious traditions, mostly Christians, including United Methodists. And the person in charge of that, Rabbi Melissa Weintraub, who is the founding co-director, said, listening to those who disagree with us is part and parcel of what it means to listen for God's voice. We need to investigate our differences courageously. Next slide, please. That brings me to the 4th point about Christianity being sometimes diverse and sometimes open to fostering relations with people of other races and sometimes other religions. As a reporter who covers religion and race, I have had a striking experience when I went to attend Mosaics, which is a conference of Christians interested in having intentionally multi-ethnic congregations. I went in November 2019 to this meeting, and there were times that I'd be in the hallway or in a session, and if I spun around, I would see people from every array of different race and ethnic group that you can imagine. It seemed unusual, given that I've often reported on gatherings where there's just one race or one ethnic group that predominated. But according to the National Congregation Study, multiracial congregations are on the rise. In 1998, 6% of congregations of all faiths in the US could be described as multiracial, which would mean they had no one racial or ethnic group constituting more than 80% of the congregation's participants. By 2019, 16% met that definition. But there's a caveat to that, just about with everything else I've talked about. I attended most of a pre-workshop, and other sessions where clergy of color discussed challenges of being what one scholar, Corey Edwards, called estranged pioneers. These were people who were not respected by white clergy with whom they served, nor understood by people of color in their home congregations that were predominantly comprised of people of their racial or ethnic group. People on either side couldn't really understand why they wanted to pursue being leaders of multiracial congregations. And I heard and spoke to clergy who acknowledged these struggles, but nevertheless remained committed to leading multi-ethnic congregations. In recent years, especially in the wake of the police killings of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and many others, there have been some efforts to do more to bring people together in more than a one-time statement or discussion about improving race relations. Last month, I followed a diverse group of evangelicals around the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture as they took an early morning tour before its regular operating hours. I talked with some of the participants the next day, and one Black minister who is co-chair of the regional organization called One Race told me he appreciated that some of the white visitors on that tour were affected by what they saw. He said, it shook some of them to their core. This was Pastor Lee Jenkins, who is a head of a non-denominational church in Roswell, Georgia. And that was encouraging because it showed that they had compassion and they were willing to acknowledge that America has had a problem in this area and this problem of racism and injustice needs to be addressed. Sometimes I'm just able to observe some of these trends, even if they don't make it into the limited word count I have in my stories. And one example was I online watched a White House summit just last month that addressed hate-fueled violence. And before the in-person audience paused for a moment of silence, they heard from leaders of Muslim, Jewish, Christian, and Sikh houses of worship that had been attacked. And Walter Kim, the president of the National Association of Evangelicals, gave the final statement before reciting St. Francis's prayer for peace. And he said, despite the profound differences of creed, we stand in the solidarity of grief and lament for all the victims of violence. We also stand in the solidarity of resolve that hate must not be met by indifference or isolation, but by courage and compassion as God's creation. Next slide, please. Lastly, US Christianity is still innovative. COVID-19 caused all kinds of problems that I'm sure many of you know about, the challenges that Christian congregations had to deal with as they dealt with this new thing among them. And I think it prompted both extraordinary and sometimes ordinary innovation. I wrote about some churches, including African-American congregations, that had to figure out ways to bridge the digital divide as they sought to keep worship going during the pandemic. 2 months in, I interviewed a pastor in rural Georgia who said she saw the sheep scattering when there was a concern about worshiping going on during the pandemic in any way. And 2 months, she said that access to a hotspot from Faircount, an organization that had sought to increase 2020 census participation, made the difference. And this was Pastor Florine Newberry, who told me that she was able to have a stronger connection, both with the internet and with her congregation, because her great nephew used his phone to live stream her sermons, including the one she delivered on Easter Sunday from the doorway of her Baptist church. So there are plenty of stories of how congregations that didn't have technological prowess started to meet via conference call, Zoom, and all these other ways, and continue to do so, not just for worship, but for Bible study and other meetings. And there also have been new forms of outreach to the needy during the pandemic. The level of new and intensified social outreach and community ministry undertaken by the nation's churches is monumental, said a report from the Hartford Institute for Religion Research. Overall, almost 3/4, 74% of churches have offered social support during the pandemic, and close to 2/3 of congregations say they have been involved in new ministries. An earlier study by the same organization showed that 1/5 of congregations had increased or added food distribution to their offerings, and 21% had started or enhanced financial assistance for their community. Bob Smetana wrote about how small churches came to the rescue a few weeks ago. You may have heard about this, when about 50 migrants from Venezuela landed unexpectedly at the local airport in Martha's Vineyard, and members of the island's clergy association stepped up to help, including a small Episcopal church that opened its shelter that had not yet been activated for the winter, and other churches sent in clothes and food and other supplies. Ironically, we were prepared, even though we had no warning, Reverend Janet Newton, a Unitarian Universalist minister, told him. And within a couple of days, the migrants who wanted to leave Martha's Vineyard were transferred to a shelter operated by state and federal governments. My last example of innovation is a recent one that I observed when I traveled from the Washington, D.C. area to Long Island for a story that's one of the many features that I get to write that come from tips from people like you. And so this was an instance where I had interviewed Father Alex Carlutzos because he was getting a Presidential Medal of Freedom and along with Sister Simone Campbell. And I just interviewed him ahead of time for a story about that ceremony that I was able to attend. And he mentioned that his Greek Orthodox Church in the Hamptons was involved in a partnership with a nonprofit called U.S. Autism Homes. And on September 11th, I visited that church in Southampton. But first I stopped at a house that was just down the street. And that is where 4 young men with autism now live, away from their families. And they stay with caregivers in this house. Each of them has their own bedroom. I followed them as they walked to attend the Divine Liturgy and saw 2 who were altar servers and 2 who sat next to each other and their caregivers in a pew. After the service, they shared a meal amid church members, and then they went on a sailing trip in the afternoon. And they shared the early part of the day with a couple of other young men with autism who are transitioning into another house that is part of this partnership that's also not far from the church. So this faith-based partnership is giving parents of children with autism who worry about how their kids will fare when they can no longer care for them an answer. The young men's parents in interviews described a level of acceptance they had not received in other congregations. And as Dimitri Donis, one of the adults with autism, told me, there is love everywhere. So next slide, please. As you consider the state of US Christianity, I think if people are willing, there is and there can be innovation almost everywhere. And perhaps some of that innovation will help address or at least de-escalate some of this polarization you hope to grapple with during this week, during your meeting. Last slide, please. I will say that I meant to say at the beginning I was going to take you on a roller coaster ride, but I guess you're probably used to doing that with the people you work with. Lots of ups and downs. So thank you. And I look forward to having a discussion now. I'm particularly interested in how you see your particular families of Christianity reflecting and responding to these aspects of the faith.
Shorter than some others. There we, is that on? Can you hear me? Okay. So I'm sure you join me in thanking Ms. Banks for her presentation this afternoon. Of course, when you're dealing with polarization, you know it's going to be sobering and it's going to take courage to speak what is going on. And certainly our journalists, experts are helpful in doing just that. And that's certainly true for Ms. Banks. So thank you again for your willingness to share the sober news and the possibilities of challenge and opportunities for the faith community to lead. We have, and I'm going to ask if we can back up to the summary slide. She's outlined the 5 aspects of the state of US Christianity and what we would call in the consensus method, the hearing. This would be called a hearing at this moment. This is not a business session. This is a hearing moment. And in a hearing, we hear each other in terms of what we've just heard. Sometimes there are dramatic presentations. It could be any number of things. But in the consensus modality, we are in a hearing, which means we are taking time to listen to each other. Sadly, we're down to about 25 minutes. And you heard earlier from Dr. Jean Hawkshurst that we are to say 2 to 3 minutes each. I'm going to encourage you to follow that in the 20 to 25 minutes we have left so that we make sure we hear everyone. This particular keynote presentation grounds us for the week to ask difficult questions. We're talking about polarization. It takes courage to engage it. It takes a spirit of openness. And in this moment of hearing, we invite you to do so. So again, we have reportedly dwindling, scandal-filled, frequently polarized, sometimes diverse, still innovative. I would like to entertain any listening or responses for the first point on reportedly dwindling. Anyone want to offer a brief comment? Yes, Archbishop, please.
Hello. Yes, how are you? No.
I'm sorry, somebody's on who is making a phone call.
They said the ADA is
I know who
complete,
it is. Okay.
but engineering is not complete. I don't know. Maybe if you call Mr. Ike, he will tell you more details.
Oh, gosh.
They did. They came. Only the engineering people came. They looked at the environment. They said some things are not properly done. Yes. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you, Archbishop. Ms. Banks?
For the last point, I think it was the case that some of the denominations, like I know Bob Smetana wrote about this in his book, that the Southern Baptist Convention prided itself for the longest time. I think it got up to 16 million. And I was like, hey, you know, we're doing well. And look at those mainline Protestants, they're not doing so well. And now that tide is turning for Southern Baptists as well. Their numbers are also not what they were. And that's an interesting point about Europe. And I don't know what the answer is, but I do think that there are like, as far as the young people, it's not only that, you know, they'd rather go out and for brunch on Sunday instead of to a church service, but it's also, I think, a sense of hypocrisy and just seeing some of these things, the money and the sex abuse scandals that are like, you know, and just in general, maybe not being felt welcomed, or that the tradition just isn't a tradition for them, even though it was for, as Bob said, the grandparents.
Thank you, Archbishop, and thank you, Ms. Banks. Any other inquiries, clarification, questions for number 1? Archbishop, looks like you covered it. Thank you. All right, Scandal Field. Anyone have any particular questions around? Yes, please, Mother Margaret. Yes.
First, I just have to say thank you, because I felt like all the headline, I feel like if I took one of those quizzes about religion, I would have gotten it all okay, because I read every single day, like many of us. The headlines sort of came in. But my scandalful question was really about the quote from Jana Reese about what those specific pieces were. I mean, I noted no one was unscathed in your reporting of these scandals among us, but how do you think those particular, shame, I can't remember exactly what they all were, but I think those were really important, and I'd love to hear them again and have to reflect on them yourself.
Yes, I'm trying to find that in where I wrote that down. I was really struck when I read what she said, because I thought that it really kind of summed it up. And she said, some of the factors were non-transparent leadership systems, a purity culture that shames victims of sexual abuse and silences them, and a sense of superiority that it could never happen here. I think that those are things that any communion, any family, any denomination could look at and say, well, where are we on this? And I was struck too about how sometimes it's the people who have survived the sex abuse who are taking it into their own hands and saying, this is what needs to be done to try to help those who have been hurt and potentially prevent it in the future. It was very interesting being at the Southern Baptist Convention in June, where there was a grassroots sea change in how the Southern Baptist Convention handled things. And there were higher ups that said, oh no, you know, we're good, you know, you don't need to do this. And it was the messengers or the delegates of that meeting who kind of rose up and said, no, you do need to do this independent survey. And as a result of an independent investigation, as a result, they had an independent investigation. And as a result, the Justice Department is looking into them. So this lack of transparency, and I'm not just talking about the Southern Baptists in general, is one of the issues.
Thank you so much. Any other questions, inquiries around number 2? Okay, let's move on quickly to number 3, frequently polarized. Yes, to the back, please.
I used to got the rector in Princeton, New Jersey, so I've seen this. My parish make nomination. My question is how do we recapture the narrative that prevents us from being? I think what feel is that sometimes we don't use our Christocentric incarnational theology to borrow from secular life instead of speaking from our. So to me, and I think that would open up perhaps a little bit more. We agree as Christians that we could agree Christian narrative versus borrowing. As Father said in our song, from music.
Thank you.
I appreciated that I was allowed to sit in with one of your groups as you were sharing and just getting to know each other, which just doesn't happen very much sometimes. And that's part of the problem, I guess, is that people don't talk to one another and get to know one another even over a few minutes. And it makes a difference. It's going to make a difference probably for the rest of your meeting. I do think it's kind of a combination of like, the science of how people should talk to each other, as well as the theology that you bring to how you talk to each other, like the rabbi talking about being courageous and getting to know each other's differences, because I think that's what you're doing here. As I was saying, I'm thinking, didn't they just do that when you were describing consensus at the beginning of this gathering? So I hear what you're saying.
Thank you for that. That's a very important point, obviously, for our time together. Oh, I see two more. Yes, Reverend Taylor, and then back here to Catherine. One online. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, and Angelique, please, a voice from the online. Thank you.
I actually want to make a comment and ask a question that kind of links 3 and 1 together a little. So my suspicion is that many of the nuns, ones that I've anecdotally talked to and have a relationship with, still have a high esteem for Christ. And many of them still see themselves following Christ, but just are disaffected with institutional church. So some of the dwindling actually may not be as severe as we think it is. On the flip side, if you look at some studies have been done of the growth of white evangelicals in particular, it has become increasingly a political faith, a kind of political ideology, more so than a set of core convictions, religious convictions. And some of the growth happened actually after Trump kind of made a strong alliance with evangelical community, at least one part of it. So I'm kind of curious what your thoughts are on that, because I also think that might kind of mislead us as well, to show that their evangelicals are growing, when in reality, a lot of those folks may actually not necessarily have strong theological convictions that make sense.
On your second point, that's a really interesting issue that, you have to deal with what the researchers say and how they define evangelicals and how the people they interview are. Like there's some groups that only use the phrase like born again or have like a 5-point definition of what an evangelical is. And then you have to try to break that down into a story. And then someone reads the story and breaks it down even more. So the whole notion of what evangelicals are is really confusing and conflated. And in fact, I will ask people who I think would call themselves evangelicals if they call themselves evangelicals, and more people say, I don't use the term, which is a struggle for me as a journalist to figure out how to define them so people know who they are compared to other Christians. But it's a problem. Yeah. And then on the youth thing and the dwindling issue, I should always say that when you talk about people who are nuns, as in N-O-N-E-S, and they're religiously unaffiliated, that does not mean they aren't affiliated with God. That's like they may just be not going to a house of worship, but that doesn't mean they don't pray. It doesn't mean they don't maybe read the Bible or whatever on their own. It's more related to where not seeing them in a pew or a chair, whatever the house of worship has for people to sit on.
Thank you. Very quickly to Ms. Lori, Catherine, and then we have someone online, please.
Thank you so much for your presentation. Sitting here and just going through the 5 points you made, saying yes. Appreciate the work that your colleagues do. One of the questions that I have about the polarization is it seems to me in the last few years that the churches had broad recognition of the polarization across the ecumenical family. And in these more recent years, at least some of us are looking internally to say the polarization seems to be really significant within each church or denomination or whatever terminology. And in our example, I mean, this is a period in the ELCA of significant polarization, and I know
bigger and bigger. And then the mandate of the presiding bishop gets further and further from the majority of folks who really don't see it. And I know that's a paradigm that's very common across the country. Is the reality that there's more polarization in terms of churches true, or is that an illusion at this stage of the pandemic as we all are just sort of coming out of our different realms online and into more and more in-person spaces?
That's a good question. I think that there is definitely polarization within the church, particular denomination, as well as, the ones fighting with and among. And I guess the United Methodists would be a good example of that now they've split because they couldn't all agree. But that doesn't mean that every church within the denomination is even going to make a choice. Some of them may just stay put because they have made the choice to stay put as opposed to going with this other group. So sometimes it's like some people just have to kind of make a decision to leave, and some people make a decision to stay. And sometimes one is easier than the other to do, given those statistics that you just mentioned about, the leadership versus the grassroots.
Thank you. We have a question online. I don't know, Dr. Scott Pierce, do you want to articulate the question, or can we bring the mic over? Okay.
Okay, I'm here. Barbara, you can contact me. Tell me when to speak.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. What's making the polarization even worse in American society is articulated in the following headline of September 28 from the media outlet known as City and State, based in Pennsylvania. Quote, Freedom from Religion Foundation launches campaign to counter Christian nationalism in state politics. Close quote of title. Now, while it goes without saying that many established church bodies in this country have taken stands, perhaps only informally, against Christian nationalism, nonetheless, this article may give the impression to the wider audience that Christians do Christian nationalism, period. So my question is in two parts. The first part is to you, journalist Adelle, and my second question is a second part of the question is to you, moderator Angelique. Hi, Angelique. This is Ray, and to Executive Director Monica. Is it true or not true that the majority of Christians in this country perceive, no, not Christians, but a majority of Americans, especially secular Americans, may perceive that Christians do Christian nationalism? I'll wait an answer to that first part, please.
I didn't catch them.
So the question, I think, was, Ray, you can correct me if I'm wrong. Do the majority of Americans see Christians as Christian nationalists?
Yes.
Do the majority of Americans view Christians as Christian nationalists?
Right.
That's a good question. I hope not, but I don't know. And I think there's also an issue of people not really knowing the full definition of Christian nationalism and having different definitions of it. So that's part of it too. But because it's interesting, because you first mentioned Freedom from Religion Foundation, which is atheist organization, mostly atheist, and very much for church-state separation. And Christian nationalism seems to see those two things conflated often. So there's a lot of terminology that makes part of the polarization happen because people don't even understand what they're talking about. So I'm not sure I can completely, I can't tell you a definitive statistic, person on the chat, because it's hard to know that, but that would actually be a really good question to have some of these research organizations ask.
Okay.
I want
Could you
to
please
agree
pass
with
that?
Ms.
Yeah,
Banks.
I'm sorry, could you please pass that on then, and I'll help. Very briefly, second part. I do have a proposal for what those Christian bodies among us could do, not in the name of the CCT, but could do to just put the word out there. No, that's not true. A lot of us Christians counter Christian nationalism. So my question is just one of process. Is that something that could be brought up later during this meeting when there is discussions of actions to be taken, or is it better that I put that in an email to Executive Director Monique and go from there? That's my question. Thank you.
I would encourage you, send an email, and that way we'll make sure it's in a parking lot for something to be discussed possibly later. But in this moment, we want to
No.
get through the 5 points, but we want to
Mhm.
thank you for your intervention. That was really very helpful to the discussion. I quickly want to go to item 4. Thank you so much.
Okay, and thank you.
Sometimes
That's why I didn't
diverse
bring it up
and then
now. Thank you
still
very much.
innovative.
thank-
Unfortunately, we are down to 5 minutes, so about 2 minutes for each one of those, sometimes diverse. Who would like to ask a question about number 4? Yes, Mark, please.
So one of the things that I said is it's probably from your taught me, if you will, of a news, religion news service. I would say that there is some nuance there. There's differences among us because, for example, I want to say you said something about some of the multicultural churches that are growing. Well, I can tell that in the Catholic Church, that is actually the fastest growing model of church. And in fact, it's gone from about 22% 10 years ago to over 36% today in the country. Okay, those are the churches that are growing the fastest and are growing the largest. But I think that we also need to utilize what we understand as diverse. Because we also have differences among us. In terms of how we understand that term. So I don't know if you want to add to that, but for us, that is the norm. Versus I think other denominations here might be in a different place.
I appreciate you pointing that out. I worked on a project where I did that. One of the stories about the multi-racial congregations with a colleague named Matthew Kressler, who's at the College of Charleston, who's an expert on Catholicism and race. And he helped me with the paragraph in that story that said exactly what you just said about the percentage of Catholics that their growth of that is more than many of the other faith groups. And also it's been a long-standing thing within Catholicism that many people don't really talk about, but it's there.
Thank you. Very quickly for this question, then we need to go to 5 quickly. Yes, please.
That's a really good question. And I'm thinking about places where that answer might be. One is the Mosaics Conference. People would know what their demographics are. I don't remember being there and thinking, I was really struck by the racial ethnic diversity. I don't remember feeling like, oh my gosh, there's a lot of young people here, but I don't think I was really struck that there were a lot of really older people there either. Although, of course, these are relative terms without disclosing what my age is. And then the other thing is the Pew Forum, like they did a big study about the faith of African Americans, and there were some dynamics about younger versus older and how they fit into multiracial congregations. And that report is out there. I can't off the top of my head tell you what's in it, but I'd suggest you look at that too.
Thank you. We need to go quickly to number 5, innovation. Still innovative. Yes, Father Walter.
Just want to say, first of all, thank you for that wonderful anecdote at the end. I'm an Eastern Long Islander myself, so I know what's going on in South Hadley. And I think what you identify is key in terms of individual relationships. I think about post-revolution France, in which the Catholic Church was decimated, but then all of a sudden you have this individual, Saint Jean-Marie Vianney, who so attached to people that droves are going to see him because they see Christianity really live, and it touches that. And I think that to me, this is how.
Thank you. And I would say that, this notion of, I purposely said, I was trying to come up with 2 words for every one of these categories, honestly, but the reportedly in front of dwindling, some people would be like, why did you even say reportedly? Well, because there are a lot of reports on it. But, the day I went to that Orthodox church, it was Family Day and there was a lot going on. It was September 11th. So they did a memorial thing outside that was really quite special. But and they knew. But the church was full. And in fact, when they remembered September 11th, the entire, or almost the entire, I didn't see everybody, but walked out of the church onto the lawn to a cross they had outside and had a service out there. So for me as a journalist and a photographer, it was a great opportunity because there was the officiants, including the acolyte with autism, at this cross with a special presentation and a remembrance of September 11th. And the whole congregation was on the lawn and the church building was in the background. So it was an example that was not dwindling, at least not that day. So
I am so sorry. It is
I
3
understand.
o'clock and I'm trying to do the journalist thing too.
Right.
Stay with time.
So I just want to say,
one quick
could
comment.
you please be free to check out RNS's website, religionnews.com. And if you would like to see a list of links of everything I talked about, if you give me your card or tell me how to reach you, or copy my QR code that my son kindly gave me for a business card just 2 days ago, you can be in touch with me and I can just send you a document with those links.
Let's
Thank
give
you.
her a hand again. Thank you again, Ms. Banks, for being with us.